I'm not 100% satisfied, though, with the way my tongue in my cheeks, people can tell, with the way anyone has handled China in this regard, including the United States. I don't think nearly enough is being done. I think we need to continue to raise awareness, and eventually we need to demand action. But where are we at on this front?
I think progress is being made, Alex. It's slow progress, it's uneven progress, and it's subject to a lot of resistance, particularly from those who are deeply invested in, well, the business as usual, the way we've conducted ourselves vis-a-vis China, which has contributed tremendously to the fix we're in at the moment. Yes, the pandemic is the immediate proximate cause, but because of the pandemic, I really believe that an awful lot of Americans are having their eyes opened to the reality that what we have long thought was the natural state of affairs, namely, we give China our jobs, our productive capacity, our intellectual property, sway over lots of other parts of the world, including control of strategic international waters and airspace in the South China Sea. We ensure their dominance in international organizations. We sit idly by as they seek to dominate space, and on, Alex. And all will be well. No worries here. Nothing to see folks move along is kind of what we have been told by, I'm sorry to say, successive presidencies of both parties. And not surprisingly, an awful lot of Americans have assumed that we knew what we were doing. And an awful lot of businessmen, and most especially people on Wall Street, have made a fortune doing it at the expense of the national interest. So I think, to answer your question, those sorts of delusional notions are now being shattered. And the question is, let me just give you this one microcosm, because you've been a big part of helping us raise awareness about it, and I think the way President Trump has responded to it. The microcosm of this is, as I said about Wall Street transferring perhaps as much as $3 trillion to the Chinese over the past few years to enable a lot of the nasty things that I just described. We're right at the cusp of having federal retirees' monies follow down that same black rabbit hole. We're going to see, if the usual suspects have their way, perhaps as much as $50 billion, at least 10 of it, going into Chinese Communist Party companies, some of which do terrible things. They oppress the Uyghurs. We might talk about that. They're used to oppress Christians and Falun Gong and all kinds of other people, as well as the Chinese more generally. They're used to build weapon systems to threaten us. This is nuts. And President Trump, when he finally learned what was afoot, responded as one would expect him to do, which is to say, this can't happen. This must stop. But the reason I mention it, Alex, is there is a determined rearguard action. I think Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, is sort of the leader of the pack. The president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, I'm told even my old friend Larry Kudlow, the National Economic Council chairman, are pushing hard to try to essentially prevent the president's direction to stop this from going forward. So this would be the business as usual. Let's keep engaging with them. Let's just hope for the best that if we do, they'll be better behaved. And I think that what we're looking at, Alex, again, in part because of the tireless work that you and Francis Martel and Breitbart and a lot of others of us are making to ensure that the American people are not duped any longer about what China is up to. The fact that it is our time's existential threat to freedom, as Ronald Reagan would say, we have a chance to pull out of this, death spiral with respect to China. If we don't, I think freedom is deeply imperiled, not just here, but around the world as well.
Sure, and there's so much logic here, Frank. I'm trying not to be too coarse with the people who are not with us on this, because it's I understand the logic. The logic is already in such economic turmoil. Why do we want to rock the boat anymore? And not to mention, as you noted, both political parties have gone along with this globalization and interconnected with China, and we've accepted so many atrocities from China. Why are we all of a sudden going to start caring all at once? All of this, I think, it makes sense logically, but that does not make it acceptable. And it is very clear that there are people within the administration, perhaps chief among them the president, who understand the threat of China and how our relationship with them must change, and it must change immediately. But there are so many people in his ear who are probably telling him that we can't rock the boat anymore, we can't do anything that will leave us even possibly more vulnerable. And that is just so far away from where I'm at right now, Frank. Where I'm at is that we need to make sure that people never forget who caused the pandemic, and that to some degree we can blame ourselves for not having a way to insulate us, protect ourselves from China that was always lying to us. And if you just read their state media, we're making a point, we read China state media every day, but I mean the headline is so sensational every single day. It's just another attack on the United States, and a dishonest one. And this is all their country's allowed to read. They don't have freedom of the press. All they're reading that Mike Pompeo is a degenerate and he's betrayed Christianity and that he's a bluffer and that the United States has not proven that we didn't cause the virus ourselves. That's what they're reading day in and day out.
Yeah, you call them state media, and of course, technically, I guess that's what they are, but they're really just propaganda arms of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist Party is indoctrinating its people to hate the United States and to blame us for the ills of the world, including what China itself has perpetrated on not just its own people, but on everybody else. And the point of this, Alex, you mentioned logic. Well, I would actually argue that the logic of what we are seeing, namely that kind of venomous propagandizing of the Chinese people, coupled with the transformation that you talk about, fundamental transformations, the fundamental transformation that China has achieved with no small measure the funding from us that I mentioned a moment ago. And then you look at what they're now doing to try to actually become more aggressive in their own part of the world, the Western Pacific notably, the South China Sea, as I mentioned, towards Taiwan, towards the Philippines, towards Guam, what they're doing to prop up their puppet who evidently still is in business, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, so he can do some of those threatening things too. And then what they're doing elsewhere around the world, the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, where they're extorting people through debt traps to essentially turn over to them the infrastructure the Chinese have built on credit. I mean, you put all this together, Alex, and unfortunately logic tells you it is insane for us to be continuing to behave as though there's no problem with China. There is, obviously, and it is becoming worse. And unfortunately, it's in the nature of bullies, and that's what fundamentally communists are. Whether you're talking about the schoolyard or whether you're talking about, high interstate politics, if they see us as weak, irresolute, accommodating, appeasing, the behavior gets worse. That's what logic tells you. That's what historical experience tells you, and it has to inform what we do now. And I think President Trump's instincts are very sound on this. He needs to know that the Breitbart audience, the American people more generally, as, by the way, successive polls are indicating, strongly support him despite what the coterie of people around him, the smartest people in the world, as he calls them, on Wall Street, and some in the business community who are deeply invested in China, as I said, are whispering in his ear, which is, you just got to keep going, Mr. President. Keep doing what we've been doing, because that way your trade deal, your first phase trade deal, well, that'll work out, Mr. President. And the Chinese won't be difficult in the months to come with respect to your reelection. The president said the other day they're trying to defeat him, for heaven's sakes. don't give me that false narrative, and don't, more to the point, give it to the president of the
Sure,
United
but
States.
he seems to respect strength, which is interesting and worth noting. But Frank, there's something that is happening though, and I do think that I spent a great deal of time on the show talking about this yesterday. That I think part of the issue here is the president knows that a lot of his base will show up and vote for him regardless of if he hits a home run on holding China accountable, because we're certainly not going to turn over the country to Joe Biden, whose family got enriched off of China, and he's downplayed the threat and called any travel bans xenophobic and literally let his corrupt, idiotic son go with him on Air Force Two to cut bogus deals with the Chinese government. So we're not going to give the country to that guy because Trump doesn't get an A+. So, and I think the president knows that, and he's got to think about that, and that doesn't necessarily help our case. That being said, we put up an article yesterday after my interview with Hogan Gidley, who is the principal deputy White House press secretary. And Hogan was very tough on China, and I mentioned in this Wall Street Journal article suggesting the Trump administration isn't really going to hold China accountable, which was I had a feeling it wasn't entirely true. Hogan came pretty close to a flat-out denial of the article on the fly, which is as good as I could have expected. And a lot of the comments at Breitbart.com were, yeah, but the White House isn't going to do anything because they don't do anything. So they're losing their reputation for taking action on this front. And I think that they need to be a little careful on that, because I think there will be people who will hit a threshold, not where they're going to vote for Biden, but where they will not vote. And I recommend against this. I'm going to vote for the president and recommend people vote for the president, even if he does nothing but disappoint me between now and November, because he's been good enough relative to Joe Biden. But that's not how everyone thinks, Frank. And I think it's a mistake to take that for granted if you're inside the White House right now.
What you just said is so important, Alex. I don't do politics. I do national security policy, as you know. But look, the truth of the matter is the American people are seeking a robust response to China. And again, I commend to you at Present Danger China, the poll that we did back in January before the pandemic by John McLaughlin, the one the Pew Center Research did more recently, the one that John McLaughlin did just the other day. You look at any of these polls, and the American people are expecting their leaders to be tough on China, especially not to reward them, for heaven's sakes, for what they've done, like giving them the thrift savings plan funds. But here's the thing, Alex, I think you're right. I mean, my instinct tells me the president's base is going to vote for him, most of it, no matter what. But that's not enough to get him elected. He has to have more support than just the people who are going to be with him no matter what. And I honestly believe a lot of them, even if they aren't going to pull the lever for Joe Biden, for heaven's sakes, how could one, are nonetheless going to stay home because they're alienated, they're disappointed, they are frustrated, they're desperate, who knows. But whatever it is, it's making a strategic error, as well as, I believe, a political one, of the first order, not to be doing what his instinct tells him, which is to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable, not just for the pandemic, but for everything that they're doing that is threatening us and freedom around the world as well.
Okay, Frank, let's go into some of these specifics that I wanted to highlight. The World Health Organization is backing China, rejecting the claim that the virus spawned from the Wuhan lab, or at least a lab was at least part of it was a factor in it. It seems like the executive branch is putting out that they're pretty positive the lab had a lot to do with it, and it's being echoed by some very serious voices in the Senate and elsewhere. But the intelligence community and the World Health Organization are on the side that it is purely, I guess, a wet market issue. What do you make of the disconnect? I mean, I've lost basically I think the intelligence community has almost no credibility at this point, and that's very sad to me. But they're public proclamations. I'm not saying that the rank and file operators who are out there aren't doing the Lord's work. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that the bureaucrats who would be in charge of releasing such information, I don't trust anything that they do at this point. And of course, the World Health Organization is culpable and in the pocket of Beijing. So, who are we to believe, or do we just not have enough info?
Well, I don't think we have enough hard data to make definitive decisions about any of this, really, and that's by design. The Chinese have denied us that information. They won't let us inspect. They've destroyed the evidence. They've bleached the wet market, for example. The people who knew a lot of this stuff have been disappeared. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we are going to be left in the dark here. I think there are two kind of basic propositions that we have to be focused on. One is it likely that a facility that was specializing in research into precisely the kinds of viruses that we've now been afflicted by was involved in some way, shape, or form? Accidental release, intentional, who knows? We don't know. But is that a distinct possibility? And I think the jury suggests at the moment that a lot of smart people, including people in the intelligence community, think that's at least a possibility, if not the answer to what happened here, Alex. Then there's the question of, did that Wuhan Institute of Virology, as it's called, actually, in the process of researching this kind of virus, actually engineer it in some ways to make it more dangerous? Gain of function, they call the process. And I think the jury's out on that too. There are lots of people who say, no, it absolutely evolved naturally. There are some people who say, well, it sure looks to me as though there was a combination that is not found in nature of this disease with HIV, I think. It's a genetic modification to make it more dangerous. Now, the explanation that's given for that is, well, they were looking for some sort of means of protecting against it. Well, maybe that's an explanation. But the jury's out. What we do know, and I think this is really the thing I would encourage every American to focus on, that Institute of Virology in Wuhan is part of an illegal, covert biological warfare program of the Chinese Communist Party. And whether it was involved in this instance or not, we don't know. But what it is there to do, perhaps by some accounts, according to a former defense minister of China, going back to Deng Xiaoping's time in the early 1990s, is to build the capacity to use biological warfare against the United States for the purposes of eliminating our population. We cannot ignore such evidence, even if this instance is not an example of it, because it may be what they have in mind for us in the future. And we are not prepared, as we can see from this pandemic, to deal with such an eventuality. We better get ready for it.
Okay, good. Smart points, Frank. Let's talk a little bit about the House Republicans launching a probe into China's influence on American universities. I, of course, commend this, but what do you know about it? What should we know about it?
Well, I hope that they'll broaden the lens a bit, Alex, because the obvious focus of effort, and it is important that it be, are these, I think it's something like 170 Confucius Institutes that the Chinese have spawned all over the campuses of the United States. It's very seductive. They pay for them. They send in professors. They give language training. And in the process, they wind up dictating not only who's going to be teaching about China on those campuses, they also wind up affecting, if not governing, the curricula, and even who are the guest speakers on the campuses. In other words, they are shaping, in much the way we talked about a moment ago, indoctrinating not just their own people, but they are indoctrinating the future, leadership and elites of our own country. So this is a focus of effort. A number of legislators have been trying to walk this back, trying to cut off funding. If those universities are taking defense dollars, for example, they've got to get rid of the Confucius Institutes. Very important project. An even bigger one, though, which I would argue is also necessary to be addressed, is the influence and other risks associated with having something on the order of 330,000 Chinese students on our campuses. As Tom Cotton said the other day, they're not studying Shakespeare and the Federalist Papers. They're there to learn hard sciences, which they are going back to China to weaponize against us. But also while they're here, because they, like Chinese companies and citizens more generally, are subject to requirements, notably what's known as the National Intelligence Law of China, Article 7, which says everybody everybody must serve the motherland's interests in collecting intelligence in support of the national defense of China against the adversaries. So you can bet that some number, maybe not all of them, but some number of those Chinese students in the United States are actually collecting intelligence against us. And that is another problem, whether it's intellectual property, whether it's state secrets, whether it's, about our personal data, things that can be used by a deadly adversary like the Chinese Communist Party. That needs to be a focus of this investigation as well, in my judgment.
Very good, Frank. I think you're right on this, too. And I think your point about the universities and the way that China is using it as an opportunity to steal American intellectual property is a crucial discussion. And I think it's one where I'm kind of sideways from some of my some other fellow China hawks that they don't see the Chinese people at all complicit. And I understand that I can't relate. I don't live under communism. I don't live with a closed press. So I'm not saying that I would be any better, though I would like to think I would if I was in China. But I know that the Chinese people are simultaneously, in many cases, victims of the communist regime. But in many cases that they are, as you say, if they have, whether or not they are of decent moral character or not, they are helping the communist regime in many areas. And this is something that I think is important not to toss that out. I'm not saying that should be our front of our mind focus, but this is the point that you're making about that they're all there to get information they can to help the Communist Party.
Yeah. Look, I think we can make an honest observation here. The Chinese people have been subjected for, what is it now, over 70 years, to the domination of, the brainwashing of, and the systematic, reinforcement of behavior that would turn even the best of people into, folks who go along with the program at a minimum, if not are champions of it. There's a relatively small number of people that are members of the Communist Party, some 90 million. There's said to be 100 million Christians in the country. And I think by and large they don't want any part of this, but they're having to make accommodations, if only to survive. I think the main point, and I want to do a shout out here very quickly, Alex, to Matthew Pottinger, who was arguably the best guy in the administration on China. He's the Deputy National Security Advisor. On Monday, he made a very important speech, basically aimed at the Chinese people, talking to them about their history, some of their best moments where people drawing upon the traditional ideals for virtuous leadership, as he put it, rose up to say, we need to be able to determine our governance. We need to be able to determine our future. It hadn't happened in a long time. The Chinese Communist Party wants no part of it. But I think an appeal over their head to the Chinese people makes sense. We need to be doing much more to help expose them to the truth rather than what they're force-fed. And we need to make sure we're not enabling the Chinese Communist Party in its efforts to take us down through any of the ways that we've talked about, whether it's influence operations, whether it's underwriting them, whether it's accommodating their bad behavior, whether it's ignoring the fact that they're running organizations like the World Health Organization. This is a moment when Donald Trump needs to stand up and resist all of that. He needs our support. I think he wants to do it, and our country requires it.
All right, Frank, I've got one more, I think, for today. No, I got two more. Okay, so let's talk about the Uyghurs for a second. China's moving 50,000 Uyghur slaves to their factory Rust Belt city, or a factory Rust Belt city. So they're basically taking them out of the concentration camps in some places and putting them to work. I guess because China's economy is probably suffering mightily during this virus. This is just a very stark reality that's happening that very few people report on, is that they have actual slaves, and they happen to be of a particular religious sect. It is a religious sect that you think would be one that the established media in the West would want to champion, yet not seeing any of this.
Yeah, what's happening to the Uyghurs is emblematic. It's worse in some respects. In some respects, it's not even as bad as what's happening to other faith communities. Falun Gong, for example, practitioners are being subjected to industrial-grade organ harvesting. death on demand, basically, for people who want their organs. But what's going on in these concentration camps, what's being done to exploit the Uyghurs and to enslave them into the manufacturing activities of the Chinese Communist Party is horrifying. I just would say, going back to what I mentioned a moment ago about the thrift savings plan, one of the means by which they're doing this kind of thing to their own people, controlling them and confining them and oppressing them, is a company called Hikvision, H-I-K Vision. And the thrift savings plan, if all other things are equal, is going to be investing in that company. It's been sanctioned by the United States government for its human rights abuses. It is obscene that we would be putting federal retirement monies into such a company that you can't legally do business with, Alex. But I think the point ought to be made that what a country that does these kinds of things to its own people, even if they're minorities, is unlikely to be very kind towards ours. That should be the takeaway for all of us, no matter what you think about, the Uyghurs and their potential for Islamic supremacism and the like, which is the justification the Chinese use for oppressing them so badly.
All right, the last question for today, Frank, is about North Korea. Do we have any sense of what's going on with Kim Jong-un, his health, and North Korea says that there's rampant fake news in South Korea. Even some South Korean outlets have apologized for some of their early coverage. We'll never get that in the United States, even if it turns out that all the reports from CNN and elsewhere were bunk. But where are we at?
Nobody knows, Alex. There's a wonderful movie called Death of Stalin that came out in 2017, I believe. When Stalin finally fell from power, died, one of the interesting scenes is the pillaging of his dacha, and out of the dacha, as the police and forces were rounding people up, were about 4 or 5 body doubles. So is that who turned up cutting the ribbon at this factory last week? I don't know. Nobody knows. But the truth of the matter is it's not unprecedented, but it is extraordinary, I think, nonetheless, that Kim Jong-un disappeared and missed a couple of really important anniversaries. And that suggests to me that there is something wrong with him, and there is going to be some instability in that government for some time to come. We'll see. But in all instances, China calls the shots there, and that's the thing we've got to keep our eye on.
Amen to that. Frank Gaffney, Center for Security Policy, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com. Thanks for all the time today, Frank. We appreciate it. It's really good work.